The folder slid across the oak table and stopped against my plate like a verdict. Warm lights from the chandelier pooled over white linen, catching the silver clip at the top as if it were a badge. My father leaned back, elbows on the arms of his chair, fingers steepled the pose he wore when he was sure he was right. My mother lifted a wineglass and watched me over the rim, her smile fixed thin as thread. Thomas tapped his spoon against a coffee cup, making a bright, impatient ring. Across from me, Robert Anderson tidied his cufflinks, eyes soft with the kind of pity men reserve for women they plan to advise. "Go on," my father said, gentle the way a coach is gentle before he blows the whistle. "Take a look, Jessica. We want to help. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had someone talk down to you while holding your life in their hands, hit that like button and share this story with someone who understands that quiet doesn't mean weak." But to understand how that folder found its way to our family table, you need to know where the habit began. The habit of being underestimated in my own home. I grew up in a wide, leafy neighborhood north of Chicago, where porches were swept before breakfast, and the mail arrived like clockwork. My father, Richard Miller, wore steel-toed boots to job sites and pried like an extra layer under his flannel. He ran a mid-sized construction company and treated success like a workshop you could tour. Here are the framed permits. Here's the blueprint wall. Here's the plaque. The chamber gave us the year we met every deadline. My mother, Maggie, kept a house that smelled like lemon oil and roast chicken on Sundays, and she kept our family story too. Ladies marry well, gentlemen provide, and anything outside those lines was a phase that would pass. When I brought home a perfect score on my AP computer science exam, Dad nodded once and asked if I'd already ironed my skirt for church. That same week, Thomas made the football team and got a used Jeep with a bow on the hood, as if the car itself had written a thank you note. At dinner, Dad launched into a speech about how women didn't need to wrestle with abstract logic when they'd be managing households and raising children with the same brains nature gave them, and Mom squeezed my hand under the table until I went still. I didn't argue. I learned the topography of that room, the way opinions rolled downhill toward Thomas, and settled there heavy as river stones. MIT was a letter I opened on the front steps because I wanted the sky to hear it. I felt the paper shake in my hands before my voice did. When I told them, Dad set his fork down as if I'd interrupted a phone call. "Boston's far." Mom said, eyes already calculating apartments and winter coats. "What will you do with a computer science degree? Fix printers?" Dad asked, smiling like it was a joke that would spare me the truth. Thomas, home from a business seminar, clapped my shoulder and said there was always a spot for me in marketing if the tech thing didn't pan out. The lemon oil smell was stronger that night. It polished away the evidence of my future and left the surface shining with theirs. College felt like stepping into a room where my voice didn't echo back as doubt. Labs hummed late into the night. I wrote code that made sense in a way that family lectures didn't. An algorithm in my junior year, clumsy at first, then elegant as it found its shape, caught the attention of two professors who spoke to me like a peer. They saw the work, not the girl, at Sunday dinners. I graduated with honors in a gown that hung heavy with all the things we didn't say. At the celebratory meal, after Dad asked if I'd considered getting a teaching certificate as a backup, and Mom said school hours were perfect for future children, I tasted the sweetness of the dessert and the grit of expectation at the same time, two textures that never quite mixed. Boston after college was a narrow apartment and a desk by a window that looked at bricks. I took a job at a struggling startup and kept a spiral notebook of their mistakes, hiring too fast, pitching too broad, listening to the loudest voice instead of the best data. When that company finally folded its boxes packed with unused potential, I knew two things: what not to do, and that the idea I'd been carrying like a warm coin in a pocket was ready to be spent. Machine learning for healthcare data wasn't a phrase that felt at home over pot roast, but it felt like oxygen when I said it alone. On my 25th birthday, I bought a sheet cake and a secondhand office chair and registered Luminary Tech Solutions with a pin I'd used since college. The room smelled like coffee and carpet glue. I had 6 months of savings and a prototype that worked better at night when the city was quieter and my doubt merciful. I called home out of habit more than need. Dad said he could loan me money if he oversaw major decisions, and Thomas suggested I come back and get real experience with the family firm. Mom asked if any of my investors were nice young men. It was the kind of support that sounded like scaffolding, but felt like handcuffs. The first hospital I cold called put me on hold long enough to memorize the entire flute section of their waiting music. The 10th said no kindly, the 20th less so. Dr. Chen at Boston Memorial said yes, but only to anonymize data and only if my algorithm stayed on its best behavior. When the readmission rate in their cardiac unit dropped, I stood in the parking lot with my hands in my coat and watched my breath fog up into a ribbon of proof. I didn't call home that night. I walked the long way to the train and let my feet learn a new map. Thanksgiving in Chicago came with flurries that tapped the windows like children asking to play. The house was warm and busy, the table set the way Mom had learned from her mother, cloth napkins folded like sales candles low enough for conversation. I made the mistake of talking about my business plan about pilots and deliverables, and the way the data sang when you asked it the right questions. Dad ate a bite of turkey, dabbed his mouth, and told me healthcare was too complex for a girl with a laptop and a dream. Thomas suggested a marketing role again, a place where I could learn the ropes without the pressure. Mom patted my wrist and reminded me that small businesses fail all the time, her voice soft, with the certainty that I was fragile and did not know it. I drove back to my hotel through streets that used to be a paper route and realized the ache in my chest wasn't disappointment, it was recognition. They were speaking a language that had always excluded me and did not know it had. In the quiet room, I opened my laptop and stared at the glow like it was a fire I could warm my life by. My phone lit up with a text from Dad asking for the names of my investors so he could vet them. He always dropped one letter when he was rushing to save me from myself. I typed a thank you and did not send it. Instead, I wrote down a rule on a hotel notepad and underlined it twice. Build in silence. Share when it's safe. When the first small investment hit the account, a clean, honest $50,000 from a believer who wanted to stay out of the way, I called my parents to share the milestone because some habits die hard. Dad asked for the investor's number. He needed to make sure I wasn't being taken. Mom wondered if the man liked me for more than my business plan. I stared at the ceiling and counted the hairline cracks that ran like rivers nobody had mapped. Thanks for caring, I said, and heard how practiced it sounded. After the call, I shut the laptop and placed the notepad on top like a paperweight holding down a fluttering page. In Boston, the office keys were cool against my palm every morning. Contracts grew like a careful garden, first one, then another, then a cluster, because one hospital talked to another doctor who knew a third. I kept my name off most public documents, choosing an acronym that sounded like a firm with a century behind it. I took a modest salary and kept my used car not because I loved it, but because modesty was a shield at home. When Mom asked how my little consulting business was doing, I said steady, and it was true in its way. Steady, like the heartbeat of a woman who has learned not to run when someone questions her worth. Years turned each with its own flavor citrus of early wins, black coffee of hard months champagne. We didn't open when we could have, because publicity would invite questions I didn't want to answer at Thanksgiving. Friends wanted to celebrate. I preferred the quiet hum of servers in the next room and a whiteboard that still had space on the right for what came next. Dad called once a month to tell me small businesses failed because of overhead and because they forgot local markets and because too many women mistook persistence for strategy. Take notes, he'd say, chuckling, and I did just not the notes he imagined. I wrote down the tone he used when he was certain, and I wrote down my own breathing when I decided not to argue. On a visit home, Mom suggested I move back to save money. She said it while dust motes danced in a square of winter light and the kettle clicked behind her. I smiled and changed the subject to her garden, which she could talk about for hours. Sometimes, survival is knowing which conversation will not hold you and choosing a different one. The night the folder slid across the table, the house smelled like pot roast and bay leaf, the scent of every Sunday we'd ever had. My father talked about opportunity in a tone that made the word sound like a train we were all meant to board. He nodded toward Robert Anderson, who wore his lineage like a well-tailored suit, and my mother mentioned that Robert was single now, as if we were swapping business and marriage proposals across the same plates. Thomas described a medical plaza deal he'd closed, numbers rolling off his tongue like proof that he and Dad still held the family's center. Dad cleared his throat the way he does when he wants the room to settle into his rhythm. "The truth is," he said, "we admire your persistence, Jess. It's time to bring some real business experience into your project." He gestured to the folder. Inside were typed pages on company letterhead, the language confident, the bullet points sharp. "An investment," he said kindly, "to stabilize your little startup, $50,000. In exchange, his pause was practiced. He understood suspense for a 60% stake and decision-making authority on major matters. "We'll get you on track." The chandelier hummed faintly. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. I looked at the neat figures and saw a lifetime in their margins. Every casual dismissal, every pat on the hand, every time little had been attached to something I'd built with both hands. I watched my mother's hopeful smile and my brother's approving nod, and I understood that this was their version of love rescue dressed as respect control, disguised as care. If I accepted, I would trade the spine of my work for a seat at their table. If I refused, I would be ungrateful, stubborn, the girl who always had to learn the hard way. My phone face down by my water glass vibrated once, quiet as a pulse. No one noticed. I didn't flip it over. I kept my hands folded in my lap and listened to my father explain how he would steer my future. My mother murmuring that sometimes help is wisdom, and Robert offering introductions like favors God forgot to grant me. It felt like standing on a dock in late November, the lake black and still, and knowing the water was colder than anyone in the house would believe. I lifted my eyes and met my father's. "Thank you for the offer," I said, my voice as even as the table. He smiled, already victorious. I let the silence sit between us long enough for everyone to lean in a fraction, the whole room tilting toward an answer they were sure they deserved. Then I placed my fingertips on the folder, not to pull it closer, but to keep it from sliding back to me again. The phone vibrated a second time, steadier, like a knock from another room. I turned it over and saw the name that meant the life they never asked about Michael Chen. 2 words on a lit screen. 2 worlds about to collide. And in that small electric moment, with pot roast cooling and the chandelier humming and winter pressing its palm to the window, I felt the line I'd written years ago stiffen into steel. Build in silence. Share when it's safe. I stood, chair legs whispering against the rug. "Excuse me," I said, and stepped into the hallway where the light was softer and the house didn't have so many ears. When I answered, Michael's voice was low and certain, the way good news arrives when it's ready. I looked back toward the dining room where the folder lay waiting like a net, and I closed my eyes on the room I'd been raised to belong to. "Go ahead," I whispered. Michael's voice was calm, the kind that steadied a storm before it started. "Jessica, the California deal just cleared. Our valuation crossed the billion mark. You did it." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The hallway light buzzed softly above me, and the murmur of my family drifted from the dining room. Silver clinking my father's low voice, explaining how he'd guide my future. "Thank you," I said at last, my words barely above a whisper. "Hold tight, Michael. I'll call you back in 5. I ended the call and leaned against the wall, palm pressed to the cool paint. For 7 years, I'd carried this secret like a flame in cupped hands. And now, without meaning to, I was about to let it burn through every careful lie I'd built to keep the peace. I walked back into the dining room. Dad was still talking, tracing lines in the air with his hands, the way he did when he thought in numbers. Of course, Thomas can handle any facility upgrades she might need. We'll start her on the right path, he said, nodding toward the folder. Mom smiled approvingly. Robert Anderson leaned back, pleased with his part in the rescue. The site would have been almost touching if it hadn't been built on everything they refused to see. I appreciate the offer, I said, setting my phone beside my plate, but I can't accept it. Dad blinked, startled. Jessica, don't be rash. This is a fair deal, sweetheart, Thomas added. 60% for the right guidance is generous, Jess. You should take it. Their confidence filled the room like smoke. I stayed still, letting them talk, their words brushing against a version of me that no longer existed. Then the doorbell rang. Mom started to rise, but I lifted a hand. I've got it, I said quietly. When I opened the front door, Michael stood there in his navy suit, crisp as always, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Behind him was Amanda, her expression composed, but knowing. Thank you for coming, I said softly. They're all in the dining room. Inside, conversation stopped at the sight of them. My father frowned, confused. Jessica, what is this? Dad, Mom, I said evenly. This is Michael Chen, my chief financial officer, and Amanda Choi, my chief operating officer. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended like dust motes in light. For a moment, no one moved. Michael stepped forward with professional grace. I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Miller, but Miss Miller needed to be informed in person. As of market close today, Luminary Tech Solutions has officially crossed a $1.1 billion valuation. Mom's fork slipped and hit her plate with a dull ring. What did you just say? She whispered. Michael continued, his tone gentle but firm. Your daughter is the founder and majority shareholder of Luminary Tech Solutions. The news will be public within the hour. The room went silent. Even the clock seemed to pause between ticks. My father looked from Michael to me, color draining from his face. You can't be serious, he said, voice trembling slightly. Jessica, this isn't... Is this a joke? I opened the portfolio and placed it beside the dinner folder he'd prepared. Inside was a glossy magazine, proof my photo under the headline, The Invisible Billionaire, How Jessica Miller Quietly Changed Healthcare. Below it, pages of contracts and patents are systems in hospitals across the world. No joke, I said quietly. I built Luminary 7 years ago. This is my company. Thomas stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. You mean all this time you let us think you were barely getting by? I never said that, I replied. You assumed it. Mom pressed a hand to her chest. You drive a Toyota, Jessica. You live in that tiny apartment. I live simply, I said, because peace costs less than pretending. Amanda spoke next, her voice steady as a metronome. Miss Miller's company supports over 300 hospital systems globally. Our predictive analytics have improved patient outcomes by 17% across multiple regions. My father sank back into his chair. The folder he'd slid toward me, $50,000 for 60%, still lay open on the table. He stared at it as though seeing his own reflection for the first time. 7 years, he murmured. 7 years, and you never told us. I wanted to, I said. But every time I tried it, turned into a lesson about how I was bound to fail. So I learned to build quietly. Mom's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. We were only trying to help. I know, I said softly. But help built on disbelief isn't help at all. From the sideboard, the clock struck 8. Each chime echoed through the stillness. Robert Anderson cleared his throat. "Jessica," he said, voice suddenly deferential. "This is extraordinary. My firm would be honored to discuss partnerships when the time is right." I met his gaze, polite but unmoved. "We're fully funded, Mr. Anderson. But thank you." Amanda handed me another folder, one marked press packet. "Bloomberg is running the story tonight," she said. "We'll need your approval for the official statement." I nodded and signed where she pointed my pen, moving smoothly, even as my family's world tilted. Thomas rose abruptly, the chair legs scraping across the rug. "So what now? You're some kind of tech queen and we just... What, clap for you?" I met his anger with quiet. "You can do whatever you need to, Thomas. I'm not asking for applause." He laughed without humor. "You let us think we were the successful ones." "That was easier than correcting you," I said. For a long moment, no one spoke. The house smelled faintly of cooling roast and candle wax. Then the front windows flared with white light. Through the curtains, a camera flash blinked against the night. Michael checked his phone. "They're here. The reporters found the address." I exhaled slowly, setting my pen down. Then it's time to stop hiding. Outside, engines idled at the curb. Amanda gestured discreetly toward the foyer, ready to brief the press if I chose to step out. I turned to my father, who still sat rigid in his chair, staring at the papers he'd prepared. His lips parted, as if he might speak, but no sound came. When he finally looked up, the pride that had always shielded his eyes was gone, replaced by something raw, real confusion, maybe fear. "Jessica," he said quietly. I didn't know." I looked at him, this man who had taught me hard work, but never how to see beyond himself. "I know," I said. "That's why I built it the way I did." Behind me, Michael waited by the doorway, calm amid the hum of approaching news crews. "Whenever you're ready," he said. I turned once more to my family. Mom's mascara had smudged under her eyes, her napkin still balled in her hand. Thomas stood by the window, half hidden by the curtain, as if shielding himself from the flash outside. For years, I'd chased their approval like it was currency. Now, standing in the center of that familiar room, I realized I no longer needed it. "Tell them to come in," I said to Michael. "Let's do this properly." The front door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the murmur of voices. Cameras glinted, microphones poised. Amanda stepped forward, professional and poised. "Miss Miller will make a brief statement," she announced. As I faced the reporters, I saw the reflection of the chandelier on their lenses, small suns in a house built on doubt. "My name is Jessica Miller," I began, voice steady. "I'm the founder and CEO of Luminary Tech Solutions. We've spent 7 years developing predictive AI for healthcare, and tonight I'm confirming our expansion following our new partnership with California Health Systems." Flashbulbs burst like stars. Behind me, my father rose slowly to his feet, as if drawn by gravity rather than will. For once, he didn't interrupt. After a few questions and brief answers, Amanda ushered the reporters outside, promising follow-up interviews in Boston. The door closed, leaving the house in hush again. Mom was the first to speak. "Jessica," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." Her words trailed off, the apology unfinished, but understood. Dad reached for his water glass, hand unsteady. "All this time I thought you needed saving." I met his eyes. Maybe I did once I said, but not from failure. The light seemed warmer now, the air less heavy. The folder with his offer still sat open between us, the absurd numbers like a relic from another life. Outside, The last reporter car pulled away, leaving only the sound of crickets and the faint hum of power lines. Michael checked his watch. "We'll need to be back in Boston by morning," he said quietly. I nodded, still standing in the glow of the dining room. Mom reached for my hand across the table, tentative, unsure. "We're proud of you," she said. Her voice trembled on the word proud, as if it had never fit in her mouth before. I gave her hand a light squeeze, neither acceptance nor rejection, just understanding. Then I turned toward the hallway where my coat hung, waiting by the door. Michael and Amanda gathered their things. The house behind me was still the air faintly sweet from the extinguished candles. When I stepped outside, the night smelled like rain and wet pavement. I stood for a moment on the porch, looking back through the front window. My father was still seated, staring down at the folder he'd once called an opportunity. It looked so small now, lying in the pool of light where my place setting had been. I closed the door softly behind me. The car waited at the curb, headlights cutting through the dark. Amanda opened the rear door, and I slid inside, the seat leather cool against my hands. As we pulled away, Michael glanced at me through the mirror. "You handled that with grace," he said. I watched the house shrink in the distance, its windows glowing against the dark Illinois night. "I didn't need to win," I said quietly. "I just needed to be seen." The city lights began to fade behind us, replaced by open highway. The rain started again, fine and steady, tracing pale lines across the glass. Somewhere between the wiper's rhythm and the soft hum of tires on asphalt, the weight in my chest shifted, not gone, but lighter. In the silence, I thought about what waited ahead: press conferences, board meetings, the noise of success that would soon surround what I'd built. And somewhere behind me, a family learning to live with the truth that the daughter they'd underestimated had built an empire without them. I leaned my head against the window, watching the reflection of passing lights blur into gold streaks across the rain. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding anymore. The road stretched ahead, clean and open, leading toward a dawn that would carry its own reckoning. But tonight, there was only the sound of the tires and the quiet hum of victory that asked for no applause. Morning light came pale and cold through the plain window, tracing faint silver lines across the armrest between Amanda and me. Neither of us had slept much. The air carried that hollow quiet of people who'd used up every word they had the night before. Boston was just beginning to wake when we landed gray sky-wet streets, the city breathing like it always had, unaware that my life had changed in a single evening. Michael met us at the curb, already on his phone, coat collar turned up against the wind. "Bloomberg's piece went live," he said as I stepped out. "The calls haven't stopped since sunrise. CNN wants a segment and the Wall Street Journal's asking for a photo." Amanda handed me a coffee still steaming. "Drink this before you read anything," she said. Inside the car, my phone blinked with hundreds of messages: investors, journalists, old classmates, names I hadn't seen since college. Among them was one from my father. The subject line read simply, "Proud of you." The body was empty. I closed the phone and let it rest in my lap. Outside, the skyline passed like an old photograph, familiar but changed. The city had been the backdrop for every struggle, every quiet triumph I'd kept hidden. Now it felt like it was looking back at me. At the office, our lobby was filled with flowers and cameras. Someone had pinned the new headlines to the bulletin board: "The woman who built $1 billion company," in silence. Employees looked up as I entered. Some clapped softly, some just smiled. I greeted them one by one, trying to keep my voice steady under the weight of their pride. By afternoon, the reporters had gathered outside the glass doors, their microphones raised like questions I wasn't ready to answer. Amanda arranged a brief statement on the front steps. The winter air bit at my cheeks as I spoke, thanking our partners, crediting my team, saying little about myself. When the last camera blinked off, I turned back inside to the warmth of the building that had grown out of that one-room apartment 7 years ago. For the rest of the week, my name was everywhere. Magazines called podcasts wanted sound bites, conferences offered keynote slots. Every acceptance felt both earned and exhausting. Somewhere in that whirlwind, I realized that silence had been easier to manage than recognition. Each evening, after the office lights dimmed, I'd stay behind to watch the city from my window. The glass reflected the room around me, shelves of awards I'd never displayed before, and beyond them, the skyline fading into snow. I thought of the house in Winnetka, of my father's stunned face at the dinner table, and the sound of my mother's fork slipping from her hand. On Thursday night, a call came from home. My brother's name lit the screen. I hesitated before answering. His voice was clipped at first, uncertain. "I didn't mean what I said the other night," he began. "I was just surprised." Surprised, I asked, gently. Embarrassed, he admitted after a pause. "I thought I knew what success looked like." His voice wavered, then steadied again. "Dad's been different, quiet. He keeps reading every article about you." I leaned against my desk, watching snow drift past the window. "How's Mom?" "She's proud, Jess. Won't stop talking about you, though. She still says you should get more sleep." A small smile pulled at my mouth. "That sounds like her." He cleared his throat. "Look, I know it's late, but if you're ever back in town, maybe we could talk properly." "I'd like that," I said. When the call ended, I sat for a long time listening to the hum of the building. The resentment that had once filled every quiet space between us seemed smaller now, less sharp. It didn't vanish, it never does, but it loosened its grip. By the weekend, the storm of publicity had reached its peak. My calendar filled with meetings, interviews, invitations. Every headline carried a version of my story, but none of them told what it really felt like, the nights coding alone by the glow of a cheap lamp, the exhaustion of proving your worth to people who'd already decided it was limited. Sunday morning brought the calm that follows every storm. I went for a walk through Boston Common, bundled in a coat and scarf, anonymous again among dog walkers and joggers. The snow had hardened overnight, crunching softly beneath my boots. I passed a coffee cart, the scent of roasted beans mixing with the cold air, and ordered a cup just to feel the warmth seep through my gloves. I found a bench near the frozen pond and sat there, steam rising from the cup in slow spirals. For the first time in years, I felt no need to check my phone. The world could wait a moment. When I returned to the office on Monday, Michael was waiting with a folder in hand. "Time wants an in-person interview," he said. "They'll be here Wednesday." Amanda joined us, arms crossed lightly. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," she reminded me. I nodded, considering. "No, it's time," I said. "They'll write it either way. I'd rather speak for myself." The interview was held in our conference room, simple white walls, the company logo behind me. The journalist, a woman named Claire Simmons, had kind eyes and the patience of someone who'd seen a lot of stories distorted before they reached print. "Why keep it a secret so long?" she asked. I thought about it carefully before answering. "Because some truths grow better in silence," I said. "When too many people doubt you, their voices start to crowd your own." I needed space to hear mine. She nodded slowly. And now I'm learning how to share it without losing that peace. When the article came out, the cover showed me standing in the same office window I'd once stared through in solitude. The headline read, "Vision and Quiet Power, Jessica Miller on Rewriting Success." My parents called that evening. Dad's voice was softer than I remembered. "You've made us proud, sweetheart," he said. "I just wish I'd known sooner." There was a long pause before I answered. "You weren't ready to believe it then," I said gently. "But that's all right. I was wrong." He admitted the words awkward but sincere. I see that now. Mom came on next, her voice bright and trembling all at once. Your father's been clipping every article, Jessica. He even bought extra copies of Time. You should see the kitchen table. I laughed quietly. Maybe I will next time I'm home. The next time turned out to be sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, I flew back to Chicago for a brief visit, ostensibly for a business meeting, though what I really needed was to look at my family without the echo of that dinner still ringing in my mind. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its white paint dulled by winter. Mom opened the door before I could knock. She hugged me tightly, her perfume the same as always. Dad stood in the hallway, uncertain at first, then placed a hand on my shoulder. Over dinner, conversation came in fits and starts. Thomas asked careful questions about the company, avoiding the bravado that used to color his tone. Dad listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it wasn't to instruct, but to understand. Do you really think machines can predict illness? He asked. Not illness, I said. Patterns. We help doctors see what's invisible until it's too late. He nodded slowly, absorbing every word. That's remarkable, he said, almost to himself. Mom passed the potatoes and smiled. She gets it from you, Richard, she said. You've always loved fixing what's broken. He chuckled, shaking his head. She doesn't need to fix what's broken, he said. She builds what's missing. The warmth of that simple sentence settled deeper than I expected. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the house had gone quiet, Dad asked me to join him in his study. The room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old wood polish. The same awards hung on the wall, but they seemed less imposing now. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I want to say something before you go back, he began. When I offered you that deal at dinner, I thought I was doing what a good father should, protecting you from failure. But I see now, it wasn't protection. It was fear. I didn't know how to support something I didn't understand. I studied his face, the creases deeper now, the pride tempered by humility. You don't owe me an apology, I said quietly. Maybe not, he replied, but you deserve one. The clock on his desk ticked softly between us. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were wet but clear. You've built something extraordinary, Jessica. And more than that, you've built it with grace. I'm proud to be your father. The words landed softly like snow on old ground, familiar yet entirely new. When I left the next morning, the driveway was rimed with frost. Dad stood by the porch as I pulled away, his hand raised in a quiet wave. I knew things wouldn't change overnight, but something essential had shifted between us. On the flight back to Boston, I watched the clouds drift below and thought about how easily silence can become both a refuge and a prison. For years it had kept me safe, but now it was giving way to something braver, truth spoken aloud, not to prove worth, but to invite understanding. The cabin lights dimmed, and the engines hummed a steady rhythm beneath my seat. I closed my eyes, letting the sound carry me forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt open, wide, steady, and mine to walk. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to break thin bands of gold stretching across the horizon. The light caught the edge of the wing, bright and clean, like a promise waiting to be kept. Spring arrived early that year, the kind of gentle thaw that carried the scent of wet earth and possibility. The river beside my Boston condo finally loosened from its frozen hold, and I could hear the water moving again when I opened the balcony door. Everything outside seemed to stretch and wake, and in a quiet way, so did I. The months after that visit home brought a rhythm I hadn't known before. My days filled with travel and decisions, but there was space, now small pauses where the noise fell away. I no longer worked to prove anything. I worked because I loved what we were building. Luminary's headquarters had expanded to an entire floor overlooking the harbor. From my office, I could see tugboats passing their slow churn, cutting silver paths across the water. Some mornings, I stood there long after the meetings had begun, just letting the view remind me how far we'd come. Michael noticed the change before I did. "You're breathing differently," he said one afternoon, reviewing projections across from me. "You used to hold your shoulders like the sky was about to fall." I smiled. "It's still there," I said, "but it's quieter now." Amanda joined us, setting her coffee on the table. "The board wants to feature your story at the annual charity gala. We could launch the Women in Tech Scholarship program that night if you're ready." The idea had been sitting in my mind since the first article came out, something that would give young women the support I never had. "Do it," I said. "Let's start with 10 scholarships. Full funding, mentorship included." Amanda's smile widened. "You really want to make me cry in this meeting, don't you?" That night, as I reviewed the program outline, my phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "Dad wants to send you something. Says you'll know what it means." A few days later, a small package arrived, no return address, just my name in my father's neat, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside was his first set of business ledgers from the construction company bound with a cracked leather strap. A note slipped between the pages read, "I built this with my hands. You built yours with your mind. Either way, it's work that lasts. Proud of you. Dad." I sat for a long time holding that note, the words quieting something inside me that had been restless for years. When the gala night finally came, the city glowed with early summer warmth. The hotel ballroom was filled with the soft hum of conversation and the rustle of formal clothes. Our team moved through the crowd with calm precision, checking details, greeting guests. I wore a navy gown, simple, nothing that shouted for attention. The lights shimmered across the room like reflected stars. Halfway through the evening, as the music softened, Amanda touched my arm. "They're ready for you." I stepped onto the small stage, the microphone waiting beneath the wash of warm light. Faces blurred beyond it, investors, hospital partners, engineers, mentors, people who had believed long before the headlines caught up. Somewhere near the front, I saw my parents and Thomas. They'd flown in without telling me. Mom's eyes were shining, her hands clasped tight against her chest. 7 years ago, I began. This company was one woman and one laptop in a small apartment. No funding, no safety net, just the belief that data could save lives. I didn't have a blueprint for success, only the memory of every time someone told me I couldn't do it. I paused, letting the quiet settle. Tonight, as we stand here, Luminary's technology touches over 50 million patients worldwide. But what matters most isn't the number. It's what we build into the future access opportunity and the next generation who won't have to ask for permission to dream. Applause rose warm and steady. I looked toward my family again. My father's eyes were wet, his expression unreadable but soft. Mom mouthed the words, "I love you." Thomas lifted his glass in a small, proud salute. After the speeches, the band started up again. I made my way through clusters of guests, shaking hands, answering questions, smiling when I could. My parents approached together, a sight that still surprised me sometimes. Dad cleared his throat. "Your speech was something," he said. "You made me think about how I used to define success." "Maybe we all had to learn," I said. Mom took my hand. "You were right, Jessica. We should have believed in you from the start." I looked at her, the lines at the corners of her eyes deeper now, her perfume faint and familiar. "You did in your own way." I said softly. You just didn't know how to show it. We stood there for a moment, three people who had finally stopped arguing with the past. Later that evening, when most of the guests had gone, I found Thomas on the terrace overlooking the city lights. He leaned against the railing, his tie loosened, a thoughtful look on his face. You were good up there, he said. I almost clapped twice. I laughed. Almost. He grinned. Don't push your luck. The grin faded after a moment. I've been thinking a lot lately. When everything blew up the press, the dinner I felt small. Angry even. But I get it now. You weren't trying to prove me wrong. You were just trying to be yourself. The wind lifted a strand of his hair, and he pushed it back absently. You know the company's been struggling since Dad retired. We hit a wall with a client who backed out. I kept wondering what you would have done. What did you do? I asked. I called them back. Told the truth. Explained what went wrong and offered to fix it, and they stayed. I guess honesty still works. I nodded. It always does, eventually. He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you too. The city stretched out beyond us, streetlights tracing thin gold veins across the dark. I didn't say anything, just stood there beside him, the cool air filling the silence in a way that felt right. A few weeks later, I invited my family to visit Luminary's headquarters. The idea made me nervous. Work had always been the one space untouched by family expectations, but it felt important. They arrived on a bright morning in June. My father wore a suit too formal for the occasion, while Mom carried a small bag of cookies for the staff. Thomas looked around the glass lobby with genuine curiosity. This place is enormous, he said, his voice echoing lightly. Amanda met them with her usual warmth, giving a quick tour of the main floor before leading us to the research wing. The air hummed with quiet energy monitors, blinking soft conversations, the steady rhythm of work. My team greeted them politely, professional, but kind. When we reached the observation room, overlooking one of the data labs, my father stopped. They're all so young, he said softly. Most of them are, I replied. That's the point. They bring new eyes to old problems. He stood for a moment, watching a small group cluster around a screen, their faces lit by the blue glow. Then he turned to me. You built all this, he said. It's more than business. It's a whole world. I met his gaze. You built yours too, I said. You just built with different tools. He smiled at that, the kind of smile that carried no pride, only peace. Before they left, Mom slipped an envelope into my hand. For your scholarship fund, she said. It isn't much, but it's from us. Inside was a check for $10,000 signed by both of them. My throat tightened as I folded it carefully. Thank you, I said. This will help someone start. That evening after they'd gone, I stood in the quiet of my office, watching the sunset reflect off the harbor. The sky shifted from gold to rose to deep indigo, the colors melting together like breath on glass. Amanda came in, setting a folder on my desk. The foundation paperwork is finalized, she said. You can announce it whenever you're ready. I looked at the name on the header, the Luminary Future Fund, and felt the calm certainty that this was what all those silent years had been for. Let's do it, I said, and make sure the first recipients come from towns like mine. Amanda nodded, understanding, without needing to ask why. As she left, I turned back to the window. Somewhere across the country, families were sitting down to dinner, voices overlapping in small, familiar ways. Mine was probably doing the same, talking about work, about life, maybe even about me. For a long time, I had thought success would feel like distance, like finally being untouchable. But standing there with the city glowing below and the hum of my company steady in the background, I realized it felt like connection instead. The kind that came not from winning, but from understanding what had been lost and choosing to rebuild it differently. Outside, the last light of the day slipped behind the skyline. I stayed there until the office went dark around me, letting the quiet settle in. There was still more ahead, more to face, more to learn, but for the first time, I felt ready for it. The silence I'd once used to protect myself had turned into something new. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was peace. The city was still when I arrived that morning, soft light slipping between the buildings and touching the harbor like glass. I unlocked the office before anyone else, the quiet humming as the systems woke one by one. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, ordinary grounding. Outside, gulls moved lazily above the water. For the first time in years, I didn't rush. I walked through each corridor, watching the sunlight stretch across the polished floors, catching the outlines of the plaques on the walls. Every milestone once felt like armor. Now they simply felt like pages in a longer story. I paused at the window overlooking the docks. The reflection showed a woman I barely recognized, the same face, but softer. Amanda arrived with her usual calm energy, a cup of black tea balanced in her hand. "You're in early," she said, setting it on my desk. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. "Too quiet at home." "Quiet can be good," she said, smiling. "You've earned it." We went over the day's agenda, press follow-ups for the foundation calls from scholarship applicants, new hires in Singapore. There was no chaos, just the steady rhythm of work that no longer defined me, but still grounded me. By mid-morning, Michael stopped by with a progress report. "The first scholarships have been awarded," he said. 10 young women starting their programs this fall. One of them's from a small town outside Des Moines. Her essay reminded me of you." I looked down at the printed list, tracing the names with my finger. "I used to think success was about what you build," I said quietly. "Now I think it's about what you leave open for others to walk through." He smiled. "Then we're building the right things." That afternoon, I left work early and drove north along the coast. The sky was wide and blue, the kind of light that made even old houses look new. I hadn't planned the trip, but something in me needed the space just to breathe without schedules or screens. I stopped at a small beach town I'd passed once years ago. The air smelled of salt and lilac. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere behind the dunes. I found a bench near the edge of the sand and sat there, watching the tide pull in. For a long time, I let the quiet settle. My father's letter had found its way into my purse that morning, folded neatly, the edges worn from rereading. I unfolded it again, reading the same words. "Proud of you. Work that lasts." The wind lifted the corner of the page, and I smiled. Somewhere between all our misunderstandings, we had found a language that didn't need translation anymore. That evening, I called my parents. Mom answered first, her voice light. "We were just talking about you," she said. "Thomas made your lemon chicken recipe again. It actually turned out this time." "Tell him I'm impressed," I said, laughing. Dad's voice came through next, steady but warmer than it used to be. "I've been thinking about that foundation of yours," he said. "You should name a building after your grandmother." "She'd like that." "I think she would," I said softly. "Maybe I'll do that." We talked until the sky turned violet and the first stars came out over the water. When we said goodbye, I realized something simple but powerful. The love I'd wanted from them had been there all along. It had just taken time to speak in the right direction. A few weeks later, Luminary hosted its summer retreat, a tradition Amanda started to remind us that success should never cost us joy. The event was held at a lake house in New Hampshire, the same one I'd bought quietly years ago, but never shared until now. When my team arrived, laughter filled the air almost immediately. Michael grilled by the water, Amanda organized canoe races, and someone brought out a guitar as the sun began to sink. The golden light caught the lake in perfect stillness. I sat at the dock's edge with my feet in the water, listening to the ripple against the wood. Amanda joined me, handing over a glass of wine. "You've built something rare," she said, nodding toward the laughter behind us. "It feels different now," I said. "Lighter." "Because you stopped carrying everyone's expectations," she said. "You just carried yourself." We sat there as the light faded the sky, turning a deep amber. It wasn't triumph I felt anymore. It was peace. A quiet kind that didn't need applause, the kind that felt like home after a long journey. In late summer, I returned to Chicago again, this time not for business, but for a small family dinner. My parents had insisted on hosting at the house I grew up in. When I walked in, the smell of roasted vegetables and thyme filled the air. The dining room looked exactly as it had in childhood, but the energy was gentler now. We ate together without the tension that once hovered at every meal. Thomas told stories about his latest project. Mom teased Dad about learning to use email properly, and the laughter came naturally. After dessert, Dad asked me to follow him outside. The night was warm, the air carrying a faint hum of cricket. He stopped near the porch steps, his hands in his pockets. "I kept your old room the same," he said quietly. "Not because I thought you'd move back, but because I liked knowing it was there." I glanced toward the upstairs window where my old curtains still hung, faded but intact. "I don't need it anymore," I said. "But thank you for keeping it." He nodded, his eyes soft. "I know. But I needed to." We stood there for a while in comfortable silence, the kind that used to feel impossible between us. He finally exhaled and looked at me. "You're doing good work, Jessica. Real work. Don't ever doubt that." "I won't," I said, "and neither should you." When I left that night, the porch light followed me down the path, glowing steady against the dark. I drove through the quiet streets of my hometown, feeling no resentment, no unfinished business, just gratitude for the distance that had turned into understanding. Back in Boston, the season shifted again. The harbor turned silver with autumn rain, and the air carried that clean edge that always made me think of new beginnings. At Luminary, the scholarship recipients sent letters, handwritten notes filled with plans and hope. I kept them in a drawer beside my desk, rereading them on quiet days. One of the letters ended with a line that stayed with me. "I'm not afraid of being underestimated anymore." Neither was I. In early winter, as the year drew to a close, we hosted our annual charity gala again. The room glowed with soft candlelight and the murmur of old friends. During my speech, I looked around and saw my family seated near the front, smiling at ease. It struck me that healing isn't about rewriting the past. It's about letting it stand, then walking beside it without bitterness. After the applause faded, I stepped away from the crowd and found a quiet corner near the windows. Outside, snow had started to fall, slow, weightless, beautiful. Each flake caught the light before vanishing against the glass. For years, I'd built a world in silence, thinking that solitude was strength. But standing there, surrounded by laughter and life, I finally understood strength wasn't silence. It was the courage to keep your peace, even when the world didn't see your worth until too late. The music softened. Someone called my name from across the room, but I lingered just a little longer, watching the snow gather along the ledge. The city beyond was blurred and bright, every light mirrored in white. Peace doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly like that snow. You just have to stop long enough to feel it land. If this story touched something familiar in you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be heard, share this story with someone who needs the reminder. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Sometimes the truest victories aren't the loud ones, they're the moments when we finally learn to rest in our own light.